to return. Everybody got that? She has not been able to return since. Leila's family returned to the States in 1997, and in 2001, they moved to Pitman, where Leila started 5th grade. 9/11 happened a few days later. It politicized Leila and started her lifelong activism on behalf of Palestine.
Because all the kids in her new class were
After
like,
graduating from PHS in 2009, Leila attended Tulane University in New Orleans and settled there. She went to Loyola University in New Orleans Law School and clerked for a federal judge after graduating. Leila was politically active in high school and in college and has been very involved in Palestinian advocacy in New Orleans more recently. She's
yeah, she has.
participated in several teach-ins there and is happy to be speaking to us tonight. So now I'll turn it over to our special guest, Leila.
Hey, everyone. Thank you first so much for being here and taking the step to spend your important time to learn more about Palestine. I myself am not too Zoom savvy, but I would ask everyone mute themselves, just so that we can avoid echoes and stuff. Yeah, so we'll get started. Mom, if you put up the map. I believe KK, I think you're unmuted. I heard Uncle Jim blowing his nose just now.
Look, I've just started to look for the mute thing.
All right, so what we have on the screen here are two maps that I kind of just wanted to put at the beginning of the conversation to contextualize and give us a sense of what it is that we're going to be talking about. The map on the left is a map of Palestine, Israel-Palestine, with New Jersey superimposed on top. So that just gives you guys a sense of the size of the entire relevant landmass that we're talking about here. And Gaza is, Mom, if you could put your mouse over where Gaza is in that little area. Gaza is about what the size, it can be superimposed on Philly, I think even New Orleans and the broader Metairie area, for those of you that are familiar with that. And then if you look at the map on the right, you can kind of see where Palestine and Israel are in relation to other Middle Eastern countries. We have Lebanon to the north, Jordan and Syria to the east, and then Egypt to the south. All right. So yeah, I just also wanted to kind of begin the conversation by just framing this as, I think this is a topic that people are very quick to dismiss because it's overwhelming for them, or it just feels like there's just too much to wrap your head around to even begin to get started. And you feel that way for a reason. It's designed to be a topic that people are afraid to engage with, because once you actually engage with it, the truth of the matter really becomes clear. And it really just benefits Israel and the Zionist project more broadly to keep the masses confused and too afraid to engage. And I just want to encourage everyone to not be afraid to engage. Don't be afraid to learn. And really, at the end of the day, this isn't all that confusing. We're talking about a period of history that's the relevant history. It's about 100 years. And we know, the truth when you see it, when you hear it. So just keep that in mind. All right, so I guess what I'll do, can we play the Rafif Ziada video, or is that not a thing? Okay, all right, so I guess we'll just start. I'm gonna kind of go through a brief history of the conflict. I've given this talk a couple times, different in-person panels in New Orleans, and it's always been like 10 to 15 minutes, really rushed. So I'm excited to be able to really like flesh this out. And like they said in the beginning of the call, if you guys have like any pressing questions, or you can't understand something I said, or there's a word like that was really important for you to here in order to grasp what I'm saying, please don't hesitate to put that in the chat so I can make sure, you know, I address it as we go. All right, so yeah, let's get started. You know, you can really start at any period in time, but I really like to start with the Ottoman Empire. You know, the Ottoman Empire, modern day Turkey, was I guess you could say, the colonial occupier of historic Palestine, modern day Israel, Palestine, for about 400 years. So really from the 1500s until the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire ruled Palestine. And at the time, for hundreds of years, and really for millennia prior to that, Muslims, Christians, and Jews all lived peacefully together and identified collectively as Palestinians. So a Palestinian Jew was not like a weird oxymoron or some kind of foreign concept. A Palestinian Christian is not either. And one thing I also kind of want to put at the forefront is this idea. This is not a religious conflict. I think it's tossed around a lot, and it's something for me that I very quickly gloss over. It's a very obvious thing for me, but I do want to take the time to point that out. This is not about Christians versus Jews and Muslims, or Muslims versus Jews. This is really a socio-political conflict. And prior to the establishment of the state of Israel and the movements leading up to it, Palestinians lived peacefully together regardless of their religion. I actually heard someone at a panel recently talk about how her grandmother used to say that prior to 1948, you actually didn't even know half the time what religion someone was until the weekend came, because everyone had a different day on the Sabbath. So Christians would go to church on Sundays, and the Muslims would go to mosque on Fridays, and Jews would have their Sabbath on Saturdays. And it was just this thing where it was like everyone was part of this identity, regardless of their religion. So, and I don't think that we can really talk about this accurately without talking about a very valid and real history of anti-Semitism that's existed in the world. I think that has been the impetus for Zionism, and Zionism's really at the core of what we're struggling against here. And I'll get into all of the details of Zionism, but, you know, for, you know, millennia, Jews have faced persecution throughout the world, throughout time and throughout space. And whether they were, you know, regardless of where Jews were in the diaspora, whether they wound up in Europe or in Middle East or in North Africa, the subjugation and the oppression that Jews have faced historically and still currently face today is legitimate and very real. And if, you know, you think about like Europe in the, you know, pre-colonial era, Jews were the other. You know, Jews were always the other before you have people of other races, before this concept of race was something that people really worked with. Jews were always the second-class citizens. They were relegated. They had their own languages and customs and cultures and practices. And so what we really see over time, not just in Europe, but mainly in Europe, you see anti-Semitism taking hold and taking foot in Europe and throughout the world at different times, and, you know, sometimes worse than others. And I think really what this leads to is a legitimate fear for a collective safety, for a fear for themselves, for themselves. And where I want to kind of pick up here is what's going on in Europe in the late 1800s, right? So you have this guy, Theodor Herzl. He's a Jewish European guy, and he was the founder of the concept of Zionism. He coined it. And Zionism is this idea that Jewish people have a inherent divine right to a country, to a homeland. Ironically, Zionism didn't always believe that the Jewish right to a homeland was Palestine or modern day Israel. In fact, early Zionist thinkers and Jewish leaders throughout Europe had tossed around all different kinds of ideas for where to establish a Jewish homeland. Other than Israel, the most seriously considered one was actually Uganda. That was voted down by European Jewish leaders before settling on historic Palestine, modern day Israel. And so you have Zionism as this idea of a persecuted minority who's been persecuted for millennia, deserve to be safe and have their own home. Sounds good, right? But this idea of Zionism exists in the late 19th century European colonial framework. At the time of when Zionism came about, you're at the height of British colonial rule. England had colonies in Egypt, India, Jamaica, New Zealand, Australia, all over Africa, South Africa being the most prominent British colony. And I don't think it's coincidental that Zionism is a byproduct of that colonial framework, right? This idea that a group of folks have a right to a divine right by God to own and inhabit and rule a body of land. I think for some of my some other folks, one thing that can be helpful to think about too is manifest destiny in terms of the American historical political context. We know about this idea that, Americans were, this land was ours and we had to expand west with pioneers and westward expansion. And this was our, God-given right to do this. And we spread our Christianity throughout the land of America. Manifest destiny can be, I think, a good comparison tool for something like Zionism, something that's in the context of a colonial framework that empowers folks, a group of people, to some kind of divinely given right. So things start to change around World War I. As we know, World War I was July 1914 to November 1918. So if you look at the first map all the way to your left, that is historic Palestine. That was what Palestine looked like. It was all Palestine, and it was like that for millennia. It was like that under Ottoman rule. It was like that for hundreds of years. And like I hope I explained at the beginning of the call, everyone who lived there was Palestinian, regardless of whether they were Jewish or Christian or Muslim. So, in World War I, around this time, you have a stage, you have a guy named, sorry, I lost track of myself. So,
All four.
yeah, I have it. Sorry, I just lost my lines. So Britain in 1917, Britain's foreign secretary sent a 67-word letter to Lionel Walter Rothschild. One of his descendants actually passed away last week. Walter Rothschild was a figurehead of the British Jewish community, and the letter eventually became known as the Balfour Declaration. So it's a letter from the British government to a prominent Jewish political leader within England. And it says, it's 67 words, I'll read it real quick. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So what you have here is you have basically an official endorsement of Zionism by a ruling European colonial power. In other words, you have the British government saying, all right, Zionism, all right, European Jews who believe in Zionism, we're endorsing this idea, you have our backing. And this was this was the world's most powerful country at the time, not to be taken lightly. At the time that this letter was written, Palestinian Arab natives comprised over 90% of the population. So again, that map all the way to the left, 90% of the people living in that landmass were native Palestinian Arabs. And Palestine was, someone say something, Palestine was still under Ottoman Empire rule at the time. Shortly after this letter was written, 1 month later, England captured Palestine from the Ottomans, and Palestine fell under British colonial rule, joining the ranks of other countries like India, Jamaica, and that list I went over earlier. So now you see a shift in Palestinian society from being ruled historically for hundreds of years by the Ottoman Empire and the systems and things that were constructed over those hundreds of years that made society flow. And now you have a brand new colonial occupying force in charge of the government, just, you know, running things. And this occupying colonial force had basically guaranteed and publicly professed an intent and a desire to see to it that this land be given off and given away to European Jewish thinkers. So the next era in history following the Balfour Declaration era, we have it's called the British Mandatory Period. Basically, the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the group that existed before the United Nations. The League of Nations gave Britain mandatory power of Palestine in 1922, basically a few years after England captured Palestine from the Ottoman Empire. During this time and throughout the next couple of decades, Britain facilitated mass Jewish immigration to Palestine and collaborated with the pre-state settler community to form armed groups. So, true to the Balfour Declaration's promise, England did what it could to shift a population of European Jews as quickly as it could to this Palestinian land. And again, let's root this in the context of anti-Semitism. This wasn't out of the kindness of England's heart to see to it that, you know, we provide these political thinkers with their desires. No, it's a way for them to get Jews out of their country. You know, this was perfect for them. It served two goals at once. So while you have a foreign country making a colony out of Palestine, England, they're encouraging European immigrants and settlers to come and establish a home in their colony. This didn't go over well. And as you can imagine, communications and at the time, like in the 1930s, it's not like there was like easily accessible radio broadcast, television, cell phones. So the Palestinian population wasn't even aware of England's intent written in the Balfour Declaration for quite some time. It took a while for the import of the Balfour Declaration to actually leak down into Palestinian society for Palestinians to understand what that meant for them in their future. And so in the 30s is when we really see some of the first most marked resistance efforts from Native Palestinians against not just Zionism, but really the British colonizers at this point. The era of, or the years of 1936 to 1939 are marked as the Arab Revolt. You see general strikes happening within the Palestinian community, withholdings of tax payments, boycotting Jewish products. A peasant resistance occurred, which was a armed, a violent and armed resistance to the British colonial occupying powers at the time. And that was from the working class in Palestine, the peasant class. So you have people from, the Arab National Committee, the governments, all the way down to the little guy, really getting involved and realizing, okay, push is coming to shove. We have England colonizing us and in charge of us. They're importing all of these European immigrants, and their stated goal is to turn this country into not a place for me. So by 1939, Britain had amassed about 30,000 troops in Palestine. And in a response to the Arab Revolt, and also just as part and parcel of the colonial project, villages were bombed, curfews were enacted on the Palestinian Arab population, homes were demolished, administrative detentions were used, summary killings were deployed. And I think it's also really important to point out that within the social fabric of Palestine at this time, right, you're starting to see these I wouldn't say divisions, but there's now a noticeable identity shift, because the Jewish Palestinian population is now being separated and treated differently than the Christian Palestinian and the Muslim Palestinian population. The stated goal of the British colonial project was not to establish a Christian state or a Muslim state, it was to establish a Jewish state. And so you start to see these changes in social identities and social fabric. I think importantly, what else is happening during this time in the late 30s? World War II, the Holocaust. We know what happened during the Holocaust, atrocious, unspeakable. And it fit perfectly in line with the decades-long plan that England had set up for the land of Palestine. So that takes us to the end of the Holocaust, end of World War II, and the UN partition plan era. We're now in the 1940s. England had now been I don't even want to say occupying, colonizing Palestine from 1917 to 1947, so about 30 years. If you zoom in, Mom, on that second map, what we see here is what the population of Palestine looked like in 1946. So what you're going to notice is the yellow is Palestinian land, the green is Jewish land. In the few decades that England was the colonizing force, colonizing governing power of Palestine, their efforts to bring over European Jewish immigrants worked. The Jewish population of Palestine had skyrocketed from single-digit numbers back in, the teens to 33% of the population. That 33% had control of about 6% of the land, as you can see in that map. Conversely, Palestinians had now, non-Jewish Palestinians, now I have to reframe the definition. Non-Jewish Palestinians comprised about 67% of the population and had 94% of the land. The UN General Assembly had recommended partitioning Palestine into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. This was under Resolution 181. And this partition plan allotted 55% of Palestine to the Jewish state, leaving 45% of the land for the Arab state. And that's what that third map represents. That is what, and I want to take a minute to kind of talk about the significance of the partition plan. Anyone can look at the second and the third map and see just how ridiculously unfair, objectively unfair, this division of land is. The bulk of the population is now being subsumed into a minority of the land size. And basically overnight. One of the other things I want to point out is the actual land that was designated for the Jewish state was the good coastal fertile land. The stuff that was left for the Arab state was the arid dry land. It wasn't where all the, the good agricultural resources, fishing resources were. And I really just kind of want to also like take a step back from all these fancy historical facts and like just really think about what this means. You know, in the 1940s, you basically have a group of European countries deciding what to do with the remnants of a European colony. When, Gandhi helped liberate India from England, you didn't have the United Nations dictate exactly how that was going to happen. That's what we see happening here. A group of folks are saying, okay, well, this is what we think is fair. We're going to take the 66% of this population, give them 45% of the shitty land, the 33% of this population, they're going to get 2/3 of this excellent land. And what does that actually mean, though, for the people that lived in the areas that are now green? We don't talk about that. And that's really, I think, the Palestinian experience is never really considered. And that's part of that. Where did those people go? How were they moved? What was the impetus for them to move? Right. And so that's kind of one thing I definitely want to touch on. Palestinians, when they see this partition plan, they rejected it. Why, in what world would anyone accept this and say, sure, have at it, y'all? No. So upon the partition plan, the world didn't need Palestine's consent to proceed. And that's always the case for the colonizer and the colonized and the oppressed and the oppressor. The world, you don't need the permission of the oppressed or the colonized subject in order to colonize them. So in May 1948, the British mandate expired and the state of Israel was born. From 1947 to 1949, we see what we refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophe. If you can look at those two maps in the center, what happened at this time was that more than 500 Palestinian villages were destroyed, 15,000 people were killed, and 750,000 people were displaced. At the time, the entire Arab population was 1 million. So we're talking about 3/4 of the population was displaced. And my family was one of those families. I think, yeah, we have a little map there. So my family, you see the city Ashdod. It used to be called, for millennia, it used to be called Isdud, and that's where my family's from. For centuries, my family lived there. And when my grandmother and grandfather were, adolescents, like 10 years old, they heard what was happening in nearby villages, for example, like Deir Yassin, where you have these Zionist militias coming in and literally lining up all the men and executing them in front of their families and forcing the women out. Or also just shooting the women and children. Ironically, a lot of I'll touch back on that. But yeah, my family had heard about these massacres and decided to flee. They didn't want to die. They didn't want to face imminent death. And so what they did was they grabbed some things and they headed south. And the expectation was that they would return. No one thought that they would be gone forever, never to see their homeland again. And so my family went from Isdud all the way down to Khan Yunis in Gaza, modern day Gaza. And you see that second arrow is pointing to Khan Yunis. So they set up tents, the tents turned into projects, and my grandmother was never able to return to her ancestral homeland of hundreds of years ever again. My grandmother died in Gaza a caged old woman, unable to leave, unable to get adequate medical treatment. And it's one of my life goals is to be able to go to Isdud and bring her with me in spirit. Yeah, so, you know, what's interesting is that today, 80% of Gaza's population are modern day population. So 80% of the people in Gaza today are descendants of refugees, such as my family. About 20% of the people who live in Gaza have historically always lived in that Gaza region of Palestine. But the 80% of people who live there today are descendants of the Nakba, people who were forcibly displaced. And what you have now, basically you had about 150,000 Palestinians who remained on what became the Jewish land, right? So we have about 1 million Palestinians, 750,000 of them are displaced, a good chunk are killed, and then 150,000 managed to remain where they were. I remember growing up, my dad always used to say that those people were the bravest people because they refused to leave. But what happened to their descendants today? You know, today they are referred to as Arab Israelis as a form of erasure. They're Palestinians. And they comprise 20% of Israel's population today. To put that in context, about 14.4% of the American population is Black. So in Israel, you have about 20% of the Israeli population are Palestinians, referred to as Arab Israelis. They, for the first 2 decades after the creation of the state of Israel, they lived under tightly controlled military occupation for 20 years. Eventually, they were granted Israeli citizenship, hence why they're called Israeli Arabs. They speak, you know, Hebrew, they speak Arabic, they practice Islam, they live within Israel. And a lot of times, if one of the really like common Zionist talking point will be like, well, Israel's not racist, we're not anti-Arabs, the Palestinians participate in our government, they can run for office, yada yada. And we'll get to why that's not exactly the case. But the fact that they can't even be referred to as Palestinians, I think just speaks for itself.
Hey, Leila, I'm going to stop the recording for a second and do it in 2 parts. So you're going to hear an interruption. I just want to. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. So yeah, so you have this huge population shift, this massive displacement, and really ethnic cleansing is what it is. What happened? Well, Egypt takes over Gaza, Jordan takes over the West Bank. Could you pull up one of those maps of maybe even one of the first maps, Mom, just so I can point out those different areas? Or I guess the loss of land over time works too. So the West Bank is that larger mass of land, yellow land on the right, and Gaza is that littler yellow land over there. Yeah, okay. Okay, so when I refer to the West Bank, that's the area over there that I'm referring to. Gaza's over there. Jordan borders the West Bank, and Egypt borders Gaza. So, you know, hence why those countries kind of took over and, you know, became in charge of those areas that were not a part of the new state of Israel and didn't really have any like unified or any kind of, you know, cohesive governing body or representative group. Yeah, in the late 1950s, Yasser Arafat, that's hopefully some of you guys have heard of him, but he formed Fatah, one of the 2 major political parties in Palestine, still around today. A lot of times today, you'll hear about Hamas versus Fatah. Hamas, the, you know, religious, violent political party, and Fatah, the more secular, non-violent political party. Hamas is associated with Gaza, Fatah is associated with the West Bank. But Fatah was founded in the 1950s by Yasser Arafat. Couple, decades later, 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was formed. I'm sure many of you have also heard of the PLO and are familiar with that term. The PLO is basically just a coalition of political parties and liberation groups within Palestine, mainly Fatah, the People's Front or the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a secular communist armed group. At the time, the parallel to that, the non-secular version was the Muslim Brotherhood. And that was also operating in the West Bank and Gaza as well. Mom, were you trying to point something out on one of those maps? No, okay. All right, so yeah, now if you look over where the 1967 map now. So in June 1967, a 1-week war breaks out, the 6-day war. In Arabic, in Palestine, we refer to this as the Neksa, meaning the setback. So you have the Nakba, the catastrophe, when the state of Israel was created, when 90% of the population was displaced. And then you have the Neksa, which is it's the setback, and it's a further regression of Palestinian control over Palestinian land. The war basically resulted in Israel seizing Syria's Golan Heights towards the north, the Jordanian annexed West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and the Egyptian occupied Gaza Strip. So the difference here from 1948 to 1967, 1948, you have the state of Israel. You have Palestinians being forcibly displaced to 2 separated chunks of land. Neither of them are controlled by Israel per se, right? You have the West Bank controlled by Jordan. You have Egypt controlling Gaza. You have the 1967 war, and the end result of that is now Israel is now in charge of those land masses. Israel is now occupying those land masses. That opens up Gaza for Israeli settlers to live. That opens up the West Bank for Israeli expansion and the further theft of Palestinian land. From this war, around 280 to 325 Palestinians were displaced, and about 100,000 Syrians were displaced. And it's also this time that we really start to see the United States' relationship with Israel change to one of a more full and unconditional support. So US imperialist interests are now being fleshed out and realized. Prior to 1967, the world really wasn't sure what to make of Israel and its military prowess or its ability to really be its own independent, autonomous country. But in this 1967 war was really, Israel's debut on the world stage as a formidable world power. It defeated several countries' armies. And at this time, we see in the United States political discourse kind of shifting in its approach to Israel to one of, this could be a really good outpost for our interests. We have these mainly white Europeans kind of in the middle of all these savage brown Arab Muslims, and this could be a really good sphere of influence for us to have. And Israel can hold their own. I mean, look, they beat all those countries at war. So we got a formidable ally over here. That's kind of really what was happening in the States. Now, following Israel's win, despite international objections, Israeli settlement construction in the occupied West Bank and occupied Gaza begins. So, as if the partition plan didn't give Israel enough, as if that wasn't good enough, Israel then said, okay, well, now I'm going to actually go beyond what international law permits, and I'm going to now establish and encroach further and further upon the little shitty pieces of land that we bothered to leave you. Right? So you see Israelis going and setting up settlements in Gaza and setting up settlements throughout the West Bank. And if you look at the map all the way to the right, you kind of see, particularly in the West Bank, what that actually looks like. You have splintered and fractured fragments of land with settlements strewn throughout. There were settlements in Gaza. The Israeli settlers in Gaza withdrew in 2005. So there are no longer any Israelis living in Gaza. There are no Israeli settlements in Gaza, but there were for a very long time. What results essentially is a two-tiered system where Jewish settlers in the Palestinian territories are given the rights and privileges of Israeli citizenship, while Palestinians who live in that same area remain living under military occupation. And that's still true to this day. So if you compare the furthest two maps of the West Bank, in 1967, you look at the West Bank. That whole mass of land is supposed to be for Palestinians. When you look at the map all the way to the right, you see the reality in which Israeli settlers have established themselves. Even though settlers in the West Bank and Palestinians in the West Bank live within the same borders, two different sets of laws apply to them. One group of people gets military law applied to them. I wonder who. The other group of people gets regular good old civilian law applied to them, despite the fact that they live in the same place. What do we call a two-tiered system where the treatment and the rights bestowed upon a group of people are differentiated on the basis of their ethnicity and or religion? Apartheid. This is an apartheid state that we have. So over the next 2 decades, Israel continues chipping away at land designated for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and begins to enforce more and more restrictive, oppressive control over the Palestinian population in both Gaza and the West Bank. And that kind of takes us to the late 80s, the first Intifada. As you can imagine, the 1967 war, the fallout from that, and then just 20 years going by of continued and persistent Israel continually and persistently operating outside the confines of international law and being given the green light by the international community to do so. Everyone kind of looked away. And meanwhile, Palestinians relegated to literal second-class citizenship and are being further and further compressed into tighter and tighter areas and driven out of their homes more and more. Things start to get really tense. People can't take it anymore. And so we have the first Intifada. In Arabic, Intifada means uprising. You'll hear in the media today, Zionists saying they're calling Intifada revolution. They want another Holocaust. That's not what Intifada means. Intifada is literally the Arabic word for uprising. And like the Arab Spring is a term that described the socio-political movement that happened in Egypt and the rest of the Middle East a couple years ago. Same with the Intifada. It's just a term used to describe a political movement. It's this era, it's from 1987 to 1993, and it's characterized by strikes, mass protests, civil disobedience, and really intense Israeli repression of Palestinians during this time. University closures, summary killings, deportations of activists, home destructions. One of the more notorious aspects of the first Intifada was the break their bones policy. And I want you guys to imagine, what technology was like in the late 80s, right? There weren't things like, think about what could go viral in 1987. Well, this is that version of that. captured on camera were Israeli soldiers taking nonviolent Palestinian protesters and literally that were filmed taking stones and breaking the bones of protesters. This was caught on video and it went viral, you know, for what viral could be at the time. It was called the Break Their Bones policy. And it just became very clear to Palestinians who did engage in nonviolent resistance that this is what you will be met with. No one stopped it. The prime minister, or not the prime minister, the person in charge of the Break Their Bones policy, Yitzhak Rabin, later went on to become a prime minister of Israel. During this period of the first Intifada, 1,000 Palestinians are killed, including 237 children. Over 175,000 are arrested. And my dad, I'm very always proud to say that my dad took part in the first Intifada. He was shot protesting a university closure. My dad was born and raised in Khan Yunis in Gaza. And just to demonstrate how much things have changed over time, but when he was in his young 20s, Gazans could travel back and forth between Gaza and the West Bank. Now, not freely and not without issue, but it was possible. My dad attended, therefore, a university in the West Bank called Birzeit University. He had an apartment by there, but his family also lived in Gaza, and so he would go back and forth regularly. But what Israelis would often do to punish, students, dissidents, protesters, would be these like full university closures where they would just shut the schools down for indefinite periods of time, making it impossible for people to go to school, get their degrees, like create a future for themselves. And so a lot of what my dad's political activism revolved around was this university politics, protesting university school closures. There was one particular protest. He wrote an article about it on Mondo Weiss. But yeah, they heard that the school was being shut down, so they went to go, protest it. And for the first time, the Israeli army used live ammunition on them. My dad was shot, his brother was shot, and their best friend was shot and was fatally shot and died in my dad's arms in the backseat of a car. They were in the hospital, which was near the university, after they got shot. And the next thing you know, someone's coming in saying, oh, the tanks are approaching, the tanks are approaching. You have to leave the hospital, because if you don't, and the Israelis see that you're shot, you're going to get arrested, because that means that you were involved in protesting. And anyone there is just guilty by association, by being there. So everyone was trying to just flee the hospital. So his friend who's bleeding, my dad who's shot, they're trying to go, and they hit a checkpoint with their friend in his lap, and the soldiers, they were pleading, please let us through, or you can tell he's dying. And they waited and waited and waited, and by the time they let them through, he had already taken his last breath in my dad's lap.
Hey, Leila, can I share one thing about the university thing?
Please.
So at this time in Palestine, none of the political leaders were there. They were first they were in Jordan, and then they went to Lebanon, and then Tunisia. But the students in the universities all joined political parties, and they would have their own elections representing the main political groups, sort of like a microcosm of the PLO. And so my former husband, Mo's group was, I guess it's okay to say that out loud after all these years, in Fatah. And they did organize the protest, and it took the form of stone throwing against the soldiers. It was sort of like, it used to be like political theater. The soldiers would show up, the kids would go out and throw stones until they started firing live bullets on them, is basically what happened. And yeah, just wanted to point that out, that in Palestine, the leaders weren't there during the Intifada. They were all out of the country, and it was the local folks doing all the stuff. So sorry for that.
No, feel free to add on any other. And this was like around the time that my mom first went over there and met my dad and became awakened from the veil of Zionism, that I think in America, like anyone who, unless if you the default is to be a Zionist, right? It's like it's unless and until you stumble across something that shifts your perspective or that tells you something different that you're kind of like, oh, the veil is lifted. So yeah, Mom, if you want to add anything else, please don't hesitate. So yeah, the Intifada kind of starts. Did you want to say anything?
Just that time, it's like 8:25, so I think you just have to do it a little faster in
Okay,
case
sorry.
folks
Yeah.
have to leave.
Hopefully this
No.
isn't like boring. So the first Intifada kind
Not boring at all. Thank you, Leila.
Thanks. The first Intifada kind of fades away with the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were an agreement that were entered into between Israel and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which again is that umbrella group of Palestinian political parties that are mainly secular, and signed into in 1993. And this ended the first Intifada. What are the Oslo Accords? Well, they resulted in the formation of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority was granted limited self-rule in pockets of the West Bank and Gaza in the form of an interim government, with the goal of there being established in 2000 an independent Palestinian state. The Oslo Accords are what enabled my family when me and my sister Samya enabled us to go back there and live there. That when we lived in Ramallah, that was 1995, and the goal was to stay there forever. But as my mom often always said, I'm like, Mom, why did you give us our middle names Mohammed? You know, we thought you'd be living over there. So, you know, I always would be like, what the hell were you thinking? So the Oslo Accords just fell through. Basically, a lot of criticism around the Oslo Accords. And I'm just kind of speeding up now because of time constrictions. But one of the big criticisms is that Palestinians just kind of gave away our last thing, which was recognizing the state of Israel for a pittance that didn't even come to fruition. And now is there a going back to a pre-Oslo understanding of the territory? I don't know. Sorry, I'm going to skip over some things. Things just keep getting worse and worse in Palestine. In 1995, Israel builds an electronic fence and a concrete wall around Gaza. In November 1995, the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, he was the guy that created the break their bones policy. So he was actually assassinated by a far-right Israeli extremist in retribution for even engaging in the Oslo Accords. So here we are, Palestinians being like, we gave up way too much for hardly anything with the Oslo Accords. Israel got a great deal out of us. And then you have the far right wing literally assassinating their leaders, who are not like progressive leaders by any means, for doing that. So yeah, over time, Oslo Accords kind of just started to break down. No progress was made, and this really gave rise to the second Intifada. The second Intifada, the second uprising in the early 2000s, it's marked by violence. Bus bombings is usually one of the things that it's, you know, characterized by. Israel reoccupies some areas that are governed by the Palestinian Authority. They begin construction of the separation wall in the West Bank, which would separate settlements in the West Bank from from the Palestinian land in the West Bank. They created settler-only roads and settler-specific infrastructure that sliced up the West Bank even further. When Oslo was signed, there were about 110,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. Today, that number is more than 700,000. So we're talking about from 1993 to today, you go from 110,000 to 700,000 in illegal land. No, like that is land specifically designated for Palestinians. And that's still not enough. And what's crazy is that 60,000 of the 700,000 settlers are American citizens. They didn't relinquish their American citizenship. They are simultaneous American Israeli citizens. We as a country, Biden can do a lot he could, you know, there could be some kind of like political retribution or some kind of like sanction, right, for American citizens who decide to live in illegal territories abroad. Like there are things we can do. And proportionately, Americans actually make up like a very disproportionate amount of settlers. I think the second most group of settlers that come are from like Eastern Europe, a variety of different Eastern European countries. But the bulk of settlers that come into Israel, the proportionately Americans make up the most that come in every year. Yeah, 2004, Yasser Arafat dies, the second Intifada ends, Mahmoud Abbas succeeds Arafat as the leader of Fatah. In 2005, the settlements that we see today in the West Bank, there were settlements like that in Gaza. And in 2005, Israeli settlements in Gaza were dismantled. There were 8,000 Israeli settlers living in 21 settlements in Gaza, and they were relocated and received an average of more than $200,000 in compensation to relocate. In 2006, Hamas, did I mention Hamas yet? Hamas was formed in 1987, around the time of the first Intifada. And they were just kind of, I wouldn't say a dormant political party, but they didn't, not too much happened before 2006. And that's when they decided, all right, let's participate in the elections, see what happens. They didn't run a president or like an executive. They didn't think they would win, but they won. And they ran, it was in these 2006 elections that Hamas won the popular vote in Gaza and in the West Bank. But shortly after, a war broke out between Fatah and Hamas. Fatah was expelled from Gaza, and then you kind of see the establishment of the association with the West Bank and Fatah, the more secular, moderate Fatah, and Gaza and Hamas, you know, the more radical Hamas.
Hey, Leila, can I clarify something on that? Hamas was active after the time, you know, at the start of the first Intifada all the years, but they didn't participate in the political system. They were really focused on resistance tactics. And as time came on, they wanted to be part of the political system. They wanted to participate as a political party and not just a resistance group. So that's why they hopped into the election in 2006, as Leila said, having no idea that they would have that kind of success. Like, they were not prepared. They really were not prepared for that. It was quite shocking to them to have gotten seats in the Palestinian parliament. So there you go. But they were very active from 87 to 2006, just not as a political, you know, politically.
Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, so, and then in 2007, as punishment for these democratically held elections, Israel decided that they were going to initiate a land, sea, and air blockade on Gaza. So Gazans, you voted for Hamas, we're now going to punish you for that. Israel controls, to this day, every single human and object that goes in and out of the Gaza Strip, by land, by air, or by sea. Fishermen in Gaza cannot go out like very far at all before they get shot at by Israeli ships. You can't, the airport that used to exist in Gaza no longer exists. You can't fly in and out of Gaza. Israel literally controls down to the caloric level, the amount of food that goes into Gaza. So what do I mean by that? They literally figured out what the minimum caloric requirement would be to sustain life in Gaza, and that's the cap of the food that they allow to enter in and out. People cannot come and go. So my dad, back in the 80s, who could travel back and forth between Gaza and the West Bank for school, that's no longer a thing. That's a thing of the past. Today's Gazan population, 50% of which are, more than 50% of which are under the age of 18, they've never seen a life outside of Gaza. Many of you know the reporter Motaz, famous, you know, Instagram famous journalist. He literally, the first time he was on a plane was when he was able to leave Gaza in like January. That was his first time leaving Gaza, period, and his first time on a plane, and it was a military plane to Doha, and that's not uncommon. Palestinians in Gaza, like, dream of going to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. but they can't go. But any one of you sitting here today could buy a ticket to Tel Aviv and go tomorrow. But my cousins who live there, who've lived in that land for millennia, can't do that. If any of you were Jewish, you could actually move to Israel today and become an Israeli citizen. And if you wanted to, you could go to a settlement and get like vouchers and get compensated for that. So, you know. So okay, now I'm like at the really good stuff. I'm gonna try to keep it short. But this is, I think that like the history can be really bland, but I think it's really important, big picture, to understand that Palestine's not unique in the sense that like it too was a colony, right? It was a colony of various powers over time, for the Ottoman Empire for a long time, then England, and now it's, you know, under occupation by a Zionist colonial entity. This is why we refer to Israel as a settler colonial state. It descends directly from literal colonizers who gave them the green light to set up a homeland there. So what does modern day look like for Palestinians? I really want to explain it, and there's like three main groups. You have Palestinians in Israel, the Arab Israelis, that comprise 20% of the population. While they're on paper supposedly equal with Israeli citizens, the way that the legislative bodies work in Israel, it's a parliament. The Knesset's a parliament. Being such a permanent demographic minority, like pins I'm trying to think of the right word. It makes it really hard for Palestinians within Israel to accomplish anything, to do anything, because they are, for my fellow lawyers, a discrete and insular minority. There's also extreme repression of political speech and activism. And this also applies to Israelis. So like right now, if Israeli citizens are getting arrested for making posts that condemn the genocide in Gaza, or that refer to what's happening in Gaza as a genocide, right? So like Jewish Israeli history teachers that might be, you know, the Pitman version of Lovelace or Holloway, are like being rounded up and arrested by the Israeli government. And that also applies with equal force, if not more, to the Arab Israelis who literally have family, you know, that is being happened to. You have Palestinians in the West Bank. Palestinians in the West Bank, illegal settlements still continue expanding to this day. Palestinian families are routinely removed from their homes to make way for Israeli settlers. In 2021 is when we really started to see, I think, a shift in the mainstream approach to the issue of Palestine. We started to see people actually like question things and say something's not wrong here. Many of you might remember Mohammed al-Kurd from Sheikh Jarrah, but basically what was happening were there were these Israeli Supreme Court cases where they decided that these families who had lived in these homes for hundreds of years had to be evicted to make way for like New York Jews to come live there. Literally, I'm not exaggerating. And so that's part and parcel. If you're a Palestinian in the West Bank, you can expect to be kicked out of your home with no legal recourse. And don't forget, you're also under military rule. So you go to military courts. So if you're a 16-year-old like Ahed Tamimi, who gets arrested for slapping a soldier for shooting your cousin in the head, you are literally going to a military prison. You don't go to a juvenile detention center. No, you go to a military prison. You have apartheid walls. Administrative detention. So they don't even need to charge you with anything in the West Bank. They can literally hold you indefinitely for years without a charge. So you don't even get a court date. You don't know what you're in there for. That is commonplace. It's like Guantanamo Bay, but for Palestinians. And I think part of it too, like, you know, the way that the settlements fracture and split the land is by design. Now, you'd think Palestinians in the West Bank would be able to go and travel freely to different parts of the West Bank, but they can't. They're literally caged into their tiny villages and areas. Now, an Israeli citizen, not even one who lives as a settler in the West Bank, can traverse this freely. Settlers can traverse the area freely. But if you are a, Palestinian man who lives in Jenin, like, you can't ever leave Jenin. And what would take an Israeli a 30-minute drive is going to take you a 48-hour trip to get from A to Z.
Because of
Well-
checkpoints and stuff that are set up between the towns and the areas. That's the barrier. Really, anytime you leave, you have to go through the Israeli military. And it's very, very difficult. They're often closed, huge long lines. They're designed to make movement impossible.
And Israelis, there's two separate lines at a checkpoint. One for Israelis who just walk right through, and one for the brown people. There's also like very infrastructures used as a weapon, I think, in the West Bank. So redirection of water. They control electricity. Israel controls electricity completely, just shuts it on and off. My friends who spent every summer in the West Bank would tell me what they do first thing in the morning is go down to the tap and turn it on. And if water came out, it was going to be a good day because you knew they didn't shut off the water. A lot of times settlements are also located at the top of a hill, and their, sewage and wastewater is directed to come down into the Palestinian villages that are at the bottom. Now in Gaza, Gaza's, and most American Palestinians, from what I've learned, most Americans who have a connection to Palestine, they're from the West Bank. It's more like all of my Palestinian people in New Orleans, I know one of them who has family in Gaza. There dozens are West Bank. So it's us Gazans are harder to come around. But yeah, there's no travel within Palestine or outside of Gaza if you live in Gaza. So like I said with Motaz, like homeboy never saw a plane before. And many Gazans never get to go to Jerusalem. There's, Gaza borders Egypt. Egypt controls the Rafah crossing, which is, in the southern part of Gaza and now being attacked. Yeah, so even Egypt is complicit in this. Israel controls other trade restrictions. So besides being able to control the precise amount of food that's allowed to enter, Israel controls things like how much cement can come in, right? So like rebuilding everything that was just demolished in Gaza, who gets to decide how things are going to get rebuilt and where the materials are going to come from and if the materials are going to be let in. And obviously Israel controls electricity, it controls the water, it controls cell towers and internet, as we've all experienced. And more than half of Gaza's population are children 18 or younger. So what are some of the present day issues that led up to October 7th? There were basically 4 major wars that broke out in Gaza following the blockade in 2007. First war was in 2008 when I was a senior in high school. It was a 3-week war. About 1,200 Palestinians were killed, 100,000 Gazans made homeless, and only 13 Israeli deaths, 10 soldiers, 3 civilians. Another war in 2012. It was 8 days in November. 150 Palestinians killed, 6 Israelis killed. 2014, Operation Protective Edge, 6-week war, 2,300 Palestinians killed, 67 Israeli soldiers, 6 Israeli civilians. 2021. And one thing to keep in mind, y'all, there's nowhere for anyone to go. So when Israel is bombing Gaza, where are you supposed to go? Israel controls the borders. You're not allowed in or out. So you can go, and we saw how big like Philly is compared to Gaza. You want to go to South Philly to West Philly to avoid the bomb? Okay, good luck. In 2018, we saw a nonviolent movement called the Great March of Return. It was a grassroots movement where a bunch of Palestinian youth just decided enough. And they just collectively marched to the border fence with Israel day after day for months. There were dances and cultural events and all kinds of things that were happening, and 200 plus people died from being shot at by Israeli snipers. Those who were not shot at were often maimed. Snipers target legs to ensure amputations and prevent future mobility for folks. And then in 2021, there was that 2-week assault on Gaza following the Sheikh Jarrah protests and whatnot. 256 Palestinians were killed in 2021. And then really following 2021 to October 7th, 2023, Israel's energy and attention in the months leading up to October 7th was really, really focused on the West Bank. I mean, the assaults on the West Bank in the last, from 2021 to 2023 were getting to the worst they've ever been in terms of death tolls on Palestinians and incursions being made within the different Palestinian villages in the West Bank. And so a lot of folks started opining after October 7th, like, where was Israel? What were they doing on October 7th? Their focus, their military focus was geared to the West Bank. So what happened on October 7th? You know, targets were different military bases and kibbutzes surrounding Gaza. There was the Nova Music Festival, you know, that was happening on the edge of a modern day concentration camp where they were having a rave at dawn. Reports are that the Hamas militants had no idea that that was happening. I mean, I wouldn't know that there would be a music festival rave happening at dawn. So yeah, there was that. Death tolls changed over time. At first we were told there were like 19,000 dead Israelis. I think the number now is at 1,200, and the breakdown of who is like a soldier and who's just a civilian constantly changes. There's the Hannibal directive that Israel has, which is basically like you have to, it's for the greater good to sacrifice individual Israeli Jewish citizens to protect and maintain the you know, the Israeli government. So you know, Israelis, you hear like literal audio recordings of Israeli soldiers showing up to these places on October 7th, like, I think there's actual like family in there, and the commander being like, go, like, do it, like, kill the Hamas militants, take out the family with them. You see Western propaganda surrounding like 40 beheaded babies and mass rape atrocities, none of which have been fleshed out. And really, we know now that the Israeli intelligence community was aware, had detailed versions of these plans, but just disregarded them. And we can talk more about what happened on October 7th. It's very well covered. But Israel's genocidal response is, I think, why we're all here. Immediately, they responded by cutting off all electricity, water, internet, and cell service, and banned all food, fuel, medical supplies, any other forms of aid. And an air incursion began about 2 days after. That's normal, right? Israel, when it attacks Gaza, it does so by air. Carpet bombing campaigns, illegal white phosphorus bombs. Yeah. But what's different about this is that there's now a ground incursion. That's unprecedented. There's obvious mass displacement and ethnic cleansing of various regions in Gaza, the north mainly now, and it's just gotten further and further south. And now we see, so, you know, basically about 100 Palestinian civilians are killed each day in Gaza. Today's death toll, I checked, was 29,782. 12,660 of those were children. 8,570 are women. Compare that to the 2,992 women and 579 children killed in the 2-year-long Russian-Ukraine war. Just for perspective. 70,000 people in Gaza have been injured, 70% of whom are women and children. Thousands more are trapped and lost under the rubble and are not taken account into the current death toll. 85% of the population is internally displaced within Gaza. So out of Gaza's 2.3 million people, 1.9 million of them are internally displaced in that tiny, tiny area of land. And 1.5 million of those people have sought refuge in Rafah in the south, the southernmost point of Gaza that's always been designated as the safe zone by IOF. And it's now Israel's current target. Before October 7th, Rafah's population was 280,000, and now there are 1.5 million people there. According to the Washington Post, as of December 2023, Israel has carried out its war in Gaza at a pace and level of devastation that likely exceeds any recent conflict, destroying more buildings in far less time than were destroyed during the Syrian regime's battle for Aleppo from 2013 to 2016, and the US-led campaign to defeat the Islamic State in Mosul, Iraq, Raqqa, and Syria in 2017. All universities in Gaza have been bombed and completely destroyed. More than half of all residential buildings are estimated to be destroyed. I saw statistics ranging from 51 to 62% as of December. Before October 7th, there were 36 hospitals in Gaza, and as of today, only 11 are partially functional. Famine and food shortages. As of today, 500,000 people are facing famine in Gaza. The entire population is facing an acute food shortage. Humanitarian aid is routinely blocked from entry. Prior to October 7th, 500 trucks would enter Gaza a day of humanitarian aid. Now it's just a fractional trickle. No food has been delivered to the northern part of Gaza for over a month since January 2023. We're hearing and seeing reports of people being forced to eat grass, animal food like pigeon feed. People are eating donkeys, dead pigeons. Before the war, half of Gazans were food insecure to begin with, and almost 80% of Gazans relied on humanitarian aid.
May,
Yeah.
I think we have to take a break there and call it officially over. It's getting pretty late. Excuse me. I think what we'd like to do is officially stop. At this point, we're going to have Samya Abu-Orf is going to do a spoken word piece for us. What?
I have a little thing to read for Samya.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
It wasn't on your thing. But we're happy to hang and chat for a while too after we officially close down. But just, recognizing we did go over in time and want to respect your time and whatnot.
This always happens. Once Samya's done, I do want to just briefly talk on some next steps for people. Can I just do that real quick? It'll take 60 seconds.
I also put a PDF document in the chat that has resources in it where you can donate, who you can call, news sources to read and follow. So please look in the chat and open up the document if you want to learn more.
Yeah, and I just want to make a pitch. Please post on social media. It makes it a lot less, I know it feels stupid, but it makes it so much less scary. The more we see a change in the mainstream dialogue. So please post. It literally takes nothing. People are dying. You can make a post. Go to a protest. It's fun. Call your reps. Engage in the democratic process. Don't vote for Biden. BDS. Use your dollar. Boycott Israeli products. Don't go to Starbucks. They're supporting Israel. Don't buy Sabra hummus. It's manufactured in illegal Israeli settlements. Don't buy SodaStream. SodaStream is too. And get involved with local organizations. There's a group, South Jersey for Gaza. There's the Philly Palestine Coalition. But most importantly, continue following the news, continue learning about Palestine, and please just be an unapologetically loud voice for Palestine. This is just the things that we've all witnessed have torn our souls, in pieces over and over again. We sit here in the comfort of our own homes. Please always speak on Palestine. I know someone who lost his job for speaking on Palestine. It's the least we can do. We owe it to them. So with that, Samya Abu-Orf is my younger sister, and more importantly, she's a queer Palestinian American poet living in South Philly. She's going to share one of her recent poems with us as we close. Samya is also a PHS grad from the class of 2012. Samya lived in Palestine too, but she was pretty young and doesn't remember all that much about it. My mom wrote this, by the way. Regardless, she too has been a lifelong activist, including working with Students for Justice in Palestine at Loyola University, Chicago, where they passed a resolution to divest from companies with Israeli ties. As a radical leftist, Samya's poetry is deeply rooted in both personal experience and political ideology, and she hopes to inspire faith in a liberated future for all marginalized people. So with that, Samya, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I just want to clarify quickly that our SJP did pass a resolution to divest, and then we were summarily told that our student government did not have the right to do that. And then they brought in Israeli lobbyists to give people written statements to read at our quote unquote retrial for voting on divestment. And we could, anyway, I can't talk about that right now, but I'm going to read a poem for you that I wrote a few weeks ago. I'll let the poem speak for itself. It's difficult to hear and it's difficult to read. It's called What Could Be Said. I'm not sure what could be said about Gaza, about the way the moon has abandoned its post and light is lost and the sun has erupted to rain its fire over Gaza, over the streets and vendor carts, over the schools and once quiet verandas, over bone-bricked limbs and body bags. Perhaps there is nothing for me to say. Now that you've seen the mangled bodies of our children, all eyelashes and teeth and skinny legs, that sweetest chirp of voices, splintering, shattered beneath the weight of the drums of war, the resounding compliance, there is nothing to be said now. As the men dig the miniature bodies from the rubble coffins laid out for them, shaking their ragdoll bones inside their skeleton skin, there is nothing to say now. No possible way to properly lament this loss, this wretched, singular catastrophe. And for those left alive, where is the future? When there is nothing but this moment, when each dust-coated breath is a miracle and blood-red rage streams from their eyes, when terror is the only color in your dreams, when the apocalypse has come early and the barefoot have no place to run, where can the future be? When the bodies lie still, under the rubble, still a victory sign, a serenade sung out from the small hands of the young girl on her baba's shoulders, a love song, a eulogy, a hallelujah choir, still upright posture, still keffiyeh-clad joy, still dance and drumbeat, still breath, still courage and dignity and resolve louder than any bomb that drops. And there, that is all I have to say. Thank you for having me. I'm proud of everyone from Pitman who, wants to learn more about this, wants to be more educated. And as always, once you're educated, it's really, unfortunately, like brown people like myself, like my sister, we are really easily painted as kind of like radical, crazy people, it's really easy to disregard what we say in popular discourse and culture. But to be totally honest, as with many of the culture wars in the United States, white people have a lot of power to do more and say more and enact more change. Unfortunately, a lot of white people either don't think it's their place, don't think that they are educated enough, or don't have the courage, unfortunately, to say the things that could enact change on the behalf of people around the world. It's said that we live in the belly of the beast here in the United States, and it's more important than ever for white people who hold political power, who hold, the ability to create change, to do so where and when they can. And right now is a place where and when you can enact change with your voice, with your feet in the streets, with calling your representatives, and making it so that genocide cannot be enacted in our names with our tax dollars. So I'll finish what I'm saying and I'll be done now. But again, thank you for having me. And I applaud everyone for being here tonight.